Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Charles from the channel Books on Stereo, and I'm here to bring you a special edition of In Conversation. We're going to be doing this podcast style, and I'm joined by the amazing Natasha, who has a YouTube channel just recently started called the Book Diva 401, same name that she's on Instagram. So definitely go subscribe to her. But Natasha, how are you doing today?
Hey Charles, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. How have you been?
I have been doing good. And for you guys wondering like what's the topic going to be about for this video, it's already in the title, but I had a stroke of just something just sparked in my head. I was watching another booktuber's video and they were talking about, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Natasha. I don't know if you have read Abby Jimenez. She's the author of the Friend Zone, I think the Happily Ever After playlist, and then the
Yes,
most recent release, Life is Too Short. Are you familiar with those books, Natasha?
I am. Yes, I am. I haven't read either of them yet, but I'm very familiar with her.
Okay, so in not too much spoilery detail, at least in the first book, The Friend Zone, I think a lot of people know about one of the main issues in this book is that our main character deals with infertility issues, and then for 95% of the book and that 5% in that epilogue, things start to change in a very unrealistic manner where everything's solved and everything is resolved. And I kind of had a moment where I was like, what? I don't even know how to fully phrase this. It was like, what? Sometimes can you take a HEA too far in a romance, if that makes any sense? So
It does.
I know that that's one of the crux of like one of the things that to be a romance you have to have a happily ever after. But when I was thinking about what that author did in that book, I was a little bit like, that's a little problematic. The first thing that I was thinking about with happily ever afters, I'm saying not all of them are problematic, but what do you think so far? Do you think they can be problematic, Natasha?
Um, Absolutely. I think I have several thoughts in
Hmm.
regards to HEAs being problematic. Um, First of all, I don't agree with there having to be a happily ever after in order to be classified as a romance. Um,
Mm.
I think it is. So if we talk about contemporary romance versus historical romance, I think they're very different when it comes to HEAs. In today's day, you can still have a character explore a romantic, intimate relationship that would help that character develop themselves and not have a marriage and children in the end to be considered a happily ever after. Um, it may be the journey that the character is on in order to find their truth and live who they really are. I think when you have your typical, if every book has a marriage and kids and the couple never argues and they live happily ever after, I think it's very unrealistic. And
Hmm.
that's just my opinion, but I think it can be very unrealistic. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that because I realize that people who read romances, not all people, some people who read romances are reading it as an escapism. So they want a happy ending. They don't want to read about something sad.
Hmm.
Um, but a happily ever after doesn't have to be sad or end in marriage and children, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying. The whole reason why we read romance is for the escape, but I think when it becomes problematic is when the author bends over backwards to resolve every single issue. Like if there was like a big issue, like let's say the male character was impotent, somehow the author would find a way that he's miraculously cured, and then they can have babies, and then they get married and is a happily ever after. Or if a character did something, let's say that was problematic or something that he did in regards to the heroine. I'm kind of explaining this really wrong.
No, I get it though. So in your example, if he is impotent, uh, the author should not have to suddenly cure his ailment or his disease or his situation. Why can't that male character who's impotent be happy in finding love with his mate and still be considered a happily ever after? Not every situation has to be resolved, because think about it. Is every situation resolved in real life? No. Do people choose to be happy and make the best of the situation they have? Absolutely.
And it's
I don't know.
I that's where I kind of feel like they can be a little bit problematic because I feel like the majority of romance, the kind of prototypical HEA is like marriage and kids. But then when you deal with like some more realistic or life issues, I think it's kind of a disservice to the reader to just kind of like all of a sudden make it okay, like or deus ex machina. I think that's what the term is called, where all of a sudden everything just works out perfectly, and then they can have their sugary sweet happily ever after. Or when specifically, like let's say you have like a character who, let's say, was misunderstood for the most of the novel or was accused of some very serious things. I don't like when all of a sudden you just absolve that character just so that you can make it like, oh, it was all a misunderstanding, and now they can
Mm-hmm.
have that perfectly HEA. Why can't you just have some unresolved issues, some things that the character did do, and that's just what it is, and the characters have to learn to move on from that instead of trying to tie everything up and making this like perfect little bow where everyone is happy, everyone got what they wanted, and then voila, they have a sugary sweet happily ever after. Maybe that's
I
just a little bit
agree.
more like
100%.
Western storytelling, like the especially with like romances. I think in general are guilty of doing the epilogue after epilogue after epilogue, where you have to know like every single
Yes,
detail about the couple, what they do after this, how many kids they got over this, or like just that's why I think sometimes romance can get a little bit of a bad rep, especially with the happily ever afters. Like you just can't wave your magic wand and then everything comes together perfectly for that couple. You don't have the you can still have a happily ever after, but not to be overly happy. It could be bittersweet, but the couple still ends up together. But we don't usually get that a ton in romance.
I
But I was just wondering, what are your thoughts?
I agree. As a reader, if I'm going through a particular situation in my life and I pick up a romance book, you know, I would much rather identify with a character who maybe hasn't had everything resolved at the end of a book, but maybe experiencing that journey of finding love with another person. As a reader, I can sit back and relate much better and say, oh, wow, this is great, versus, oh, well, 300 and 400 pages later, everything is peachy and they live happily ever after. And then I close that book and I still feel unsettled. I still feel very much left alone, versus this character took this journey, was able to find
Mhm,
love, but they still have some things that they need to resolve or work out. And I'm in that same spot. So it's okay that I am where I am.
mhm,
Um, I think, especially with everything going on right now, we are looking for, there's so many people who are questioning every aspect of their life right now. And we are just looking for something to relate to, something to just have a connection to. And not everybody finds that perfect soulmate.
mhm,
Um, some people who aren't able to have children or choose not to have children, maybe they don't want to see happily ever afters with, two and three
mhm,
and four kids in the end. Um,
mhm,
I would much rather read about a couple who fell in love with the person that they took this journey with and truly has a strong foundation for moving forward. And I
mhm,
don't need epilogue after epilogue. That, I mean,
mhm,
a story does not always have to be concluded with a period. Maybe,
mhm,
and I wouldn't call it a cliffhanger in a romance, but maybe it's left unresolved so that I can put my own spin on something.
Hmm.
Or maybe that's just me holding the author, to say, you have to write me three more books. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It's
Hmm.
we as readers, I think we get very attached to stories, and it can absolutely backfire because I'll use the example of when I was a young girl. I grew up thinking that my life was supposed to end up like a Disney story. I was supposed to look at one guy, fall in love, have no issues, be married, and live happily ever after. And man, what a letdown life was if that's what I was thinking it was going to be.
Hmm.
Um, and we have a lot of new readers coming into romance. And I think that it's better for them to have optional realities versus the same reality when they're reading a book. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I completely agree. Like when you were
Okay.
just like one thought that popped into my head that goes along with some of the things that you said. Like one of the things where I've read a lot of romance, we both have read a lot of romance. Now I'm to the point where I just want someone to like not give me a happily ever after or do something different. So like I'm kind of seeing myself trying to go back to other genres where you might have a romance prevalent, but then you're like you really don't know like okay, are these two characters going to get together? Are they going to work things out? Instead of always having that safety net for me, because sometimes I do find myself being more and more critical of how romances end, especially how they handle the HEA. If like you do all the stuff to like make sure that every like if especially if the couple was like let's say they're cheating or they have like a like they're dating like someone's ex or something, then everyone by the end is usually okay with everything. Everyone is like resolved and shook hands, and everyone kind of gets to have their own happily ever after. Or especially in romance, it's usually the character who ends up jilted. They will get their own romance. So like, even then, they still find their happily ever after. But sometimes I want a little bit of like that departure, that kind of return to reality a little bit. Like especially if a couple in trouble or
Mhm.
something like that, where maybe they don't end up together. What if a romance explored the idea that maybe the one that you find and the one that you think is supposed to be your forever and ever turns out not to be, and you find someone else, and maybe deal with those emotions and see, you know what I mean, like kind of like grow with the characters a little bit. So I find that can be a little bit problematic in that they're selling a reality that isn't all the time very feasible or realistic for a lot of people, like similar to your comment about Disney movies. But I think it's very important to realize that this is fiction, an escape where you can
Mhm.
experience those happily ever after things. But I would feel like, especially for someone who doesn't believe in marriage, or for someone who can have kids, either for personal reasons or medical reasons, I really want to know like how do they feel about these types of endings that you see so much in romances? Like, wouldn't that be in some way a little bit
Mhm.
triggering to those readers when you see like that's the predominantly happily ever after? I don't know. Like, what are you thinking?
Absolutely. And especially in 2021, as readers, we're demanding more diversity in the books that we read. And I think that absolutely can include happily ever afters. And it doesn't even have to be, I would love to see an author do a happily ever after, like you said, where they don't end up with each other, but maybe the character falls in love with themselves. Maybe they were
Hmm.
able to overcome an extremely traumatic upbringing, um, and be on the brink of, you know, a breakdown or just going through as an adult some, traumatic things. Still, I want to see that person overcome that situation, and maybe they wake up and they fall in love with the life that they're choosing to continue to try to live and make the most out of. Um, everybody has so many different personal situations going on. I think it would be a wonderful thing to see more diversity in the happily ever afters. Because
Mm,
when we think about historical romance, um, almost every historical romance book that I've read, happily ever after, they turn 18, they're put on the market to marry, to have children. And when the book wraps up, you're left with the impression that they live these long, happy lives and they're married only one time. When in
mhm,
reality, back in that day, women were often viewed as property. Were they all really living happily ever after, or were the husbands gone working? Did they have mistresses? Did the wives
mhm,
become, you know, caretakers for the children? Or, were they there just to be a trophy while the, nannies took care of the children? It's kind of,
mhm,
you're given this package with this bow on it, and you're expected to just accept that this is what reality looked like back then, and I really don't think it did.
mhm. Yeah, I 100% agree with everything that you said.
I mean, I don't.
Especially with the diversity comment a little bit more. I think that's a great, like, if we want to see change, I think that's kind of the direction that I feel like we need to move in the romance genre. I think seeing more diversity in the types of endings that we can see and still call a romance, I think is very, very important because I do feel that romance is one of those special genres where you have like a certain promise that exists between an author and a reader. And it usually doesn't take too well when the author
Mhm,
breaks that promise and does something different. Like maybe gives you a happily ever after, but like not everything is
mhm,
resolved. Maybe there are some things where this character didn't get this resolved, or they didn't get your typical happily ever after. I even heard some authors say like they tried to write a happy for now, and then readers just did not like it. They wanted to know, okay, did they get married? Did they have kids? Like what happened? Da 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 da. Like I don't like an open ending to my
mhm,
ending for my romance. I want to know, readers want to know, do these characters get together and do they live happily ever after? So I think there's some expectations that are going to be very hard to dismantle in order to get more diversity in our endings for happily ever
mhm.
afters.
So you think we as readers are putting the pressure on the authors to create these endings?
I think a little bit,
What do you
yeah, because
think?
mhm.
Do you think there's an author today that's willing to take the risk of creating alternate HEAs? And if so, who do you think that, do you have an author in mind that you think would be able to pull that off?
I do a little bit. Colleen Hoover is one that, but she's like a very, very well established author, especially in her newer books, especially what people rave about Verity and talk about how it's a
Hmm.
romance. But she does a lot of things that kind of subvert normal romance tropes. I'm not going to get into spoilers or anything like that, but she's like one of those authors where you can't really peg her where she's going to be writing it. It could be quasi romance, it could be more romance bordered on contemporary. That's like one author that I can think of, but like she's at the point where she can write wherever she wants, really, and probably most people will go and buy it because of her name.
Hmm.
So I think she has a little bit more leeway, but I definitely feel like in an indie world, I could just imagine like let's take like Kerrigan Byrne. If she decides to end a book and it's not super happy and you don't know 100% if the couple is going to be together by the end, I feel like her publisher would be like, no, 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 no. Readers will riot if you do this. You have to give them a definitive, they're going to be together and they're going to be married and they're going to be happily, live happily ever after together. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Absolutely. And I agree with you. I think Colleen Hoover could absolutely pull that off. I remember reading Verity and I remember the uproar of the different comments that came from that book. Some readers were just baffled by it. I don't know if I would classify it as a romance so much. There was romance in it,
Mhm.
and it was very steamy. Um, but I think you're right. She has such a huge following, and we are so dedicated to those authors that we have just fallen in love with. We will read everything they've ever put out. They may not all be 5 stars, but we're still going to continue to read them because they made us feel something in one or two of those books. I
Mhm.
think with Colleen, I think it was November 9 that actually hooked me for her.
Mhm.
Um, but I would, and it's funny you bring up Kerrigan Byrne because so when we did the author interview with her, she has so many ideas of wanting to branch out and explore some different things. I would love for her to step outside the box, and
Mhm.
she towed the line with the dark intros for some of her books, and I'd like to see that play out in some of her endings too. And I think she can do it.
Mhm.
I think she can do it. And it would take somebody who's like, so for example, Nora Roberts, okay?
Mhm.
Um, Huge name in the world. I think that woman could write whatever she wanted to and not be affected. I mean, millions of people love Nora Roberts. I enjoy her books. I don't have them all because, man,
Mhm.
she pumps them out. But
She pumps them out pretty
um,
frequently.
I don't know. I'd love to see somebody. Yes, she does. I mean, I'm thinking to myself, man, how do you do that? But okay. But yeah, she's one I think could definitely do that and have it not be. I think a little controversy is good every now and then. Not so much to where it could damage an author. Nobody ever wants to see that, but to grab some different readers to keep things interesting. Um, yeah, I agree. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think one point that you brought up earlier
I'm
is
looking at my
that
shelves and I'm trying to.
you don't necessarily have to have a happily ever after to be considered a romance. I actually agree with that. I think the main point of having a romance is a romance has to be the A storyline, the main storyline. And to me, that's
Mm-hmm.
enough, despite how it ends. That I'm like, okay, it doesn't necessarily. I feel like me as a reader, I'm not always wedded to the idea that I need to like have a happily ever after. Sometimes I wish like, ooh, maybe what if the heroine died or something horrible happened at the end, or like when you brought up, what if it's just the
Mm-hmm.
main character figuring out how to love herself, and that's the happily ever after. It's not who they end up with; it's them falling in love with themselves and like realizing their own self worth. So I think
Mm-hmm.
especially now as romance readers, and we push for diversity in terms of, I would say more in terms of like racial ethnicity, neurodiversity, we see, and sexual diversity. I think those are probably the biggest pushes that we want to see reflected in more romance because it still isn't quite there. We are getting more books like it. I definitely feel that even though those are the big pushes, we still need to see more of that. But I think we need more diversity in terms of our endings for a lot of our couples. Like, is there like, always wanted to know, is there like a rule book written like this is what you have to meet in order to be considered a romance? Or was it just something that a collective amount of people just said, like, oh, this is what we peg as a romance, if that makes any sense? Like, is it like a fast, hard rule that you have to have a happily ever
I think
after?
I think there's an unspoken rule book, and I think that it was set from authors who started the romance genre way back when. And publishers become attached to what sells and therefore continue to try to push that. And for anybody wanting to try something different, not only do they fear what the readers might think, but they do get a lot of pushback, I feel like, from the publishers, because the publishers don't want to stray from what makes them money. I mean,
Hmm.
let's just be real.
Hmm.
Um, but and you know, this is where we as readers can come into play and really start supporting more of our indie authors, more of our self-published authors. Um,
Hmm.
you They need to know you don't necessarily have to have a big publishing house behind you to sell a good story. Um,
Hmm.
Especially with what publishing houses, you know, today, who they're choosing to back and who they're not choosing to back. I mean, it's becoming so much
Hmm.
more controversial now that I would 100% support an indie author. Show me what you got. You know, as long as you have a good
Hmm.
editor and it's not filled with a bunch of grammar issues, hey, I'm willing to give it a shot. But our world doesn't look like it did 50, 60, 70 years ago. It
Hmm.
looks different. And we need new authors to come in and write stories that are reflective of this world now.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I definitely feel that indie is where we're going to probably see the biggest amount of change, just because there is no gatekeeper like the publisher, like you mentioned, that can kind of conform, like, okay, this is what romance readers want. I just notice in general, traditionally published books tend to not be nearly as steamy or as more taboo as a lot of indie romances can get away with. Like some of the indie romances, I'm like, if you try to publish this, like, I think like most of Pam Godwin's like more recent releases probably would have been like seriously censored if they came out like a big publisher like Berkeley Romance or Avon. They'd be like, Pam, I need you to tone it down a little bit for the
Mm-hmm.
readers. But I think we are seeing that work done in the indie space, I think, but it's still not where it needs to be, and we're still getting there, making steps towards it. But I think conversations like this and really being critical of the romance genre while also, and not any way, we're not mocking the romance genre like, oh, we can't take it seriously because it has happily ever afters. No, we're saying we acknowledge that, we acknowledge the purpose that that serves in terms of the genre. But I think as you read more and more romances, sometimes you want a little bit more diversity in what you see how our characters end up with. Like, what does a romance look like when the characters don't want to get married? What does that look like? Where they just
Mm-hmm.
live together? There's so many things in modern
Right.
sensibilities that you could see interjected into a contemporary romance or paranormal, or I guess you could say like mystery thrillers or as well. You can extend it to other different subgenres within contemporary, but I think it's very important that we see just like people take more license and start to evolve what is a romance, what constitutes a romance, what does it need to have in order to be a romance? Does it have to have these typical happily ever afters that we all grown so accustomed to? Can we still have other different types of endings and still have them very much feel like romances? And we're starting to get there a little bit, but I definitely feel that there's a subset of readers that read romance that will most likely reject those books, and I get it because that's just not what they want. But I definitely feel there are romance readers, especially
Mm-hmm.
new romance readers, that are open and willing to accept these different type of endings. I think if you set your book, like let's say you called it like fantasy, you can get away with so much more in a fan if you call it a fantasy, but it's heavy romance, heavy on the romance, like with Sarah J. Maas or
Right.
Cassandra Clare. Those are technically like low key, pretty much romance fantasy, but they're not called romance. They're just called YA fantasy or adult fantasy. And just the amount of more reach those
Mm-hmm.
books have, and the more license that the author has to kind of play around with things, is just way more lax in terms of what you can do versus, not to say you're constrained by romance and those expectations, because there is a little bit constraint in every genre, but I feel like romance is a one where if the romance is not prevalent, that's one strike against you, and if it doesn't end in a happily ever after, you're two strikes and you're out. Like people will rebel. People already get angry if you call a woman's contemporary fiction novel romance. And people are like, "What? The characters didn't even get
Mm-hmm.
together. The romance only happened for like 20% of the book." So I feel like we can get there, but I think there's needs to be work done on both sides of the table with readers and with authors. So we can get these more stories that get pushed out because the authors don't want to put out a book that readers are not going to accept. So I think it's like a little bit of a two-way street.
I agree. And I'm sitting here thinking, romance gets such a bad rap. You have, and I'm just thinking back to a couple of videos I've seen over the last few months. Younger people will read a romance book and then just bash it. And I'm thinking to myself, are you bashing it because it had an HEA and that doesn't reflect your life? What is it about romance that you dislike so distinctly that you bash a book? Because you're right, a lot of these fantasy books that these people are raving over, they have heavy romance in them, but they're
Mm-hmm.
titled fantasy books. So what's the difference? What makes you bash one versus the other? Now I'm curious. I want to
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because
You
you
know,
can literally have a heavy romance plot in any subgenre, but if you call it literary fiction or mystery thriller or whatever other category or genre that you can call it, it immediately puts it in a different sphere. But I bet you if you like classify Cassandra Clare's books as romance, because I 100% they are fantasy romance. It's I think most people who read that series care about who is with who ships who together, who are their ships, and making sure their ships stay afloat. That's
mhm,
essentially in and of itself a romance. And in none of her books, she never kills off one of the main two leads. So they usually get
mhm.
together and then they have their happily ever after, which is a textbook romance. But I think when you specifically call it romance, a lot of people believe that those HEs are kind of corny and contrived. And I think in some cases they are, and they don't feel true to the character. It feels like more like just conforming to what people expect from the genre. So I think that invites more criticism. But I think
Mhm.
it's hard to explain to those readers that it's not necessarily about it is about getting the happily ever after, but it's escaping your own life and just being in the story where you know everything's gonna work out and it can just bring you just joy. It's just a fun, joyful read. I think that's where a lot of that criticism tends to come in. I think HEs are a huge part of that equation.
I can see where you're coming from with that. Yeah. It's
I think
interesting that
mhm.
I was just gonna say it's interesting that I don't know anything about the publishing world, so please don't come at me like this. But even from a professional side, not from a reader side, but from a professional side, um, the publishers who give some of these authors pushback on what genre they put them into a box. If there's romance at all in a blurb or if it's classified as romance, like some people just won't even go in that section of the bookstore. They
Mhm.
want, so for Cassandra Clare, they ship all these characters together. They want them to be, you know, to have their happily ever after. But if you say to that reader, did you enjoy that romance? Oh my God, the head whips around like poltergeist three times and the reader's ready to come at you like it's not a romance. And I'm thinking to myself, okay. And so someone who's fairly new to romance, because I just started reading romance genre technically, okay, last year. Now, if you think about it, I've been reading romance all my life, but it was never classified as romance. It was always
Mm.
classified as contemporary fiction or literary fiction. And I'm thinking to myself, and so when I'm, and this is am blowing my own mind here. So when I picked up my first romance book, it was one of Jess's recommendations last year in quarantine. I'm sitting here reading it. I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. I've technically read romance before. It wasn't classified as romance, but it had just as much intimacy, just as much relations in the book. So why am I considered a new romance reader just because this
Hmm.
book has been titled as a romance book?
Hmm.
It
It's
just
true when
baffles.
you, yeah, it's like when you take a step back and you're like all the things that you thought weren't romance, even some of like the Disney fairy tale movies, like Cinderella, like that's kind of low key a romance,
Absolutely.
but it's considered a fairy tale. But it is. Why do you think so many romance authors take the Cinderella trope or take the Beauty and Beast trope? Because they're kind of romances. They're not called a romance, but the couple ends up together at the end. And a lot of the movie is kind of like them falling in love and living happily ever after. So I think it's prevalent in our culture, but I think we don't want to call it as a romance because it's such a huge negative stereotype. And I think romance tends to be a little bit more topical, where if you read a romance from 30 years ago, most of the time it may not hold up because there may be some problematic things, but romance is really good at reflecting to some degree what readers want at that time period and what was considered okay. They're like an interesting look at society at different times. If you take like all romance published during 1990 versus all historical romance published in the 1960s, I feel like you would see a remarkable difference in how the relationship is portrayed, the characters, the sexual situations, the idea of consent versus now. Most of the stuff in those old romances you cannot get away with today in a modern day romance. People will roast you alive if you did some of those things. They'll be like, no, 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 no. Unless you're doing like a whole dubious consent, Katie Roberts type thing. No,
Right.
like, we don't. Like immediately, if some readers experience any rape or cheating or any sexual assault of any kind, they're just like, sorry, nope, putting your book down, move on.
Right. Because they want that feel good, fluffy story. They don't want,
Hmm.
the hardcore behind what in reality was some of those situations back then.
Hmm.
And I can think of many stories that I've read. So in regards to like people falling in love, and then the guy is, has to go off to war. He's drafted in the war, whatever. But 90% of this book is about him meeting a girl and falling in love and having their romance develop. But then he goes off to the war and he dies. Well, those types of books are typically classified as historical fiction. Well,
Hmm.
90% of the book is them falling in love. It's a different happily ever after because, maybe he dies in the war, but it's a romance book.
Hmm.
So going back to your question, I am curious what classifies, does an HEA actually have to happen in order for it to be classified as a romance book?
And that is a good question. So I want to ask you guys in the comments, what do you think? Do you think romances have to have a happily ever after, or do they just need to predominantly focus on a romance for a majority of the novel? I'm really curious to hear what you guys say, but I think to sum us up, HEAs aren't the worst. They but they are not the best. There's things that they can do to improve and to be more inclusive of different type of happily ever afters. But I think the whole idea of having a happily ever after is not something that's intrinsically wrong. I think sometimes you want that escape as a reader, as a romance reader. You can use that as a comfort net, and I get it. But I still think there's still an other side of the equation where you can have a little bit more experimentation on what that looks like and still be included under that romance umbrella. But yeah, I think this was an absolutely amazing conversation. even though my dog wanted to derail the conversation numerous times while we were talking. You may not hear them all because I will have edited them out, but I want to ask you, Natasha, any final thoughts about HEAs? Do you think they're the worst? Do you think they're problematic?
I do not think they're the worst. I actually have read many books that have HEAs and have left me with that, oh, that was so nice, that fluffy feeling. And there's nothing wrong with that. I actually enjoy that. But in my mind, they can be problematic. And I would like to see some authors explore some alternate endings.
Mhm. So that
How about you?
I would have to say that I love my HEAs. I'm a romance reader. I like it. But I do find myself more and more now being like, that's not what the story needed. That's not what
Hmm.
was true to the characters. Now just reading more romance and understanding the mechanics that kind of go into making a good romance, the HEA has to be true to who the characters are and what is in line with what they want as
Hmm.
characters. That's how the whole romance works. You identify with the characters, and all the conflict and all the obstacles come from what's already intrinsic to their character. And whatever the happily ever after looks like has to be in relation to the characters. So like that's a whole other topic, but I definitely feel that HEs are a good thing. They can be better, and I think there's always room for improvement. But still, at its core, I definitely don't think romance HEAs are a bad thing. I think they serve their purpose. Let's just expand upon what they can do to serve other different people looking for other different types of HEAs. But thank you again, Natasha, so much for coming on my channel. I enjoyed talking with you so much. This was such a just a thought-provoking and interesting conversation that I was a little bit kind of like, oh wow, like Natasha's making a lot of really good points. So if you guys love Natasha, go subscribe to her YouTube channel. She is amazing. You will love her content. Um, and yeah, go follow her on Instagram and on Twitter. I believe you're on Twitter, right, Natasha? Or only
Yes, I
Instagram
am.
and YouTube?
I am on
Okay,
Twitter.
and
It's Book
Twitter.
Diva 401. Yes.
So you can find a Book Diva 401 on every single platform, which is so convenient. I should have done that. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know down in the comment section down below if there's any topics that you want to see featured in a conversation episode, and I will catch you guys with a brand new video. Bye, everyone.
Bye.